who's been involved with a bunch of different associations, the BMFA, and all that kind of good stuff.
And I've been involved with Arlo-Powell auction, buying things way back when.
No longer in business.
Unfortunately. Well, thanks for having me today. I've been supporting Battersea for a while. I've given a couple lectures for Battersea on classical furniture in Richmond and furniture in Virginia at the McElwain House and in various places. I think Battersea is just really one of the best houses in the country, one of the earliest Palladian houses. I love the work that the foundation is doing with Sandy and Tony and board members like Carton. So I really take off my hat to the good work being done here to restore what is really one of America's great Palladian villas. I have not seen the restoration of the staircase yet, so I'm looking forward to seeing that. But today I'm here to talk a bit about classical furniture, specifically in Richmond and also in Petersburg. Now, geographically speaking, there's obviously a relationship because it's not too far apart. But back in the 18th century, it was a little further, and you couldn't make it as fast as you can today. So that would be kind of the premise for my talk. A little bit more about me. Went to UVA, studied history, archaeology, really got into material culture, worked a little bit on field work at Monticello, really got interested in the American Revolution and the kind of early Republic period. But it was really after school when I started going to auctions like Arlo-Powell and auctions across Virginia, Maryland, where I really fell in love with furniture, and I was able to get my hands on it. And that, I think, is the key. You have curators who work in museums, but to be able to actually crawl under a case piece or take drawers out, touch the wood, turn something over, that's how you really learn about the important aspects of furniture, like construction and woods. Styles, you can learn in a book, but helpful to see it in person. And ultimately, as far as attributing furniture to different places, including Virginia, you really have to get into the nitty-gritty of it. It's not something you can do from a picture or from a book. And so that's how I got interested in furniture, was really, I've had a lot of good colleagues, mentors along the way, people like Sumter Pretty and Ron Hurst at Williamsburg, who I'm sure you all know, have been really helpful to me in teaching me about the research that's been going on, not for a long time. I mean, Virginia furniture has really only been seriously considered within the last 70 or so years. Before that, it was all about New England stuff, and they thought nothing good was made south of the Mason-Dixon line. So the field of the study of Southern furniture and Virginia furniture is really comparatively relatively new. So that's always an interesting point to make. But I really started honing in on furniture from Virginia and Maryland, the colonial Chesapeake, and even furthermore honing in on this period, which I call the classical period in America. So really the first quarter of the 19th century really starts in the late 18th century. But for all intents and purposes, the first quarter of the 19th century is where it really takes off. And this is a period in America where we had just achieved independence from Britain. So we were kind of trying to figure out what our national identity would be. We didn't want to be British anymore. So what did we do? What did the founders do? What did a lot of early Americans do? What a lot of civilizations and societies have done over time, they looked back to the ancients for inspiration in all things, in art and culture, etc. And so in this period in America, they really looked toward ancient Greece and Rome in particular. And coinciding with this kind of interest in a new identity, a different identity from the British identity, wealthy merchants were traveling They were going to Greece and Rome for the first time. There were publications coming out like Thomas Hope, Stewart and Corbett. That really, Antiquities of Athens was the key volume. That really kind of brought antiquity to America through books, but also in the early 19th century, a lot of wealthy merchants and people who were buying and commissioning furniture and architecture were actually traveling over to see it for themselves. I know people who went on grand tours for months. I know of people who went on grand tours for years. I know people who never came back, and I don't blame them for that. But there's great stories about people. There's a guy from there's a guy from Port Royal in Virginia. Classic story where he went over there for a year, and he wrote his wife, and he basically said, I mean, I can't even describe this to you, but I'm going to bring you something back because I just have no words for it. And so he commissioned a marble top table, a mosaic table with all kinds of different precious stones. And what did he do? He shipped it in through Fredericksburg, took it to Port Royal, and had a local cabinet maker, one of the Bowie brothers, make the pedestal for it. So you have this great kind of amalgamation of old and new, going all the way back to the ancient world and coming in early America. And so this story has been told in a lot of other parts of the country. There's been a lot of work done in Maryland. There's been a lot of work done in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, some of the bigger cities. Richmond, not as much. Petersburg, not much at all. And so one of my big focuses was on this early 19th century classical period in Virginia overall, specifically Richmond, Petersburg, and some of the urban centers, Fredericksburg, Norfolk, the places you would expect to kind of be influenced by these things, where there was, a robust economy, there was a merchant class of people, there were artisans that had access to pattern books and those sorts of things. So it all kind of starts in Virginia. When we're talking about this period, I kind of identify a pivotal moment when the capital was moved from Williamsburg to Richmond in 1780. Jefferson builds what was the largest public commission of the time, the Virginia State Capitol, after what? Anybody know? A Roman temple.
Oh,
Roman temple.
In
Not a Greek
France,
temple,
in France.
but a Roman
Nimes.
temple.
Sorry.
From Nimes, there you go. And so, largest public building commission of the time in Richmond, Virginia, on top of a hill. This is an ancient city being formed in the late 18th century. This is an amazing thing. This is a very significant thing. This is a thing that reverberates across time and space. This is not just a building. And the thing you have to think about with a massive building project like this is the fact that it brought in architects, builders, people to do interiors, all kinds of artisans from places like Philadelphia, from England, from all over the place. So that brought a ton of these skilled craftsmen to Richmond, to this area, latter half of the 18th century. And they went on to build, other houses, other commissions. Some of them went on to do some things in DC. They kind of spread over time. Some of them did things in Charlottesville. But that iconic moment of the building of the Capitol is really significant. It can't be understated. And so the same people who were building the interiors of the Capitol, and John Marshall House is another example, the Masonic Lodge in Richmond. There's quite a few. If you could work wood and you could do these things, you could do carving for interiors, you could probably also make furniture, or you had some kind of ability to produce those sorts of things. And so a big thing I like to, teach people about is the fact that, builders weren't just building houses, they were also, in most cases, making furniture. And so the documentation is few and far between, so you can't always prove who made what or where it was made and some of those things. And sometimes you had somebody who came down from Boston. Classic example, Alexander Paris, who designed the governor's mansion and the Wickham House, came down from Boston. And so, one day he's working in Boston, the next day he's working in Richmond. So how would you ever tell the difference between something that was made in Boston versus something that was made in Richmond. You can look at secondary woods and things like that, but sometimes secondary woods kind of float around too. I mean, we can't forget that by the first quarter of the 19th century, you know, mass production was in place, you know, things were being shipped all around the world. And so when you look at earlier periods, it's a little bit easier. You know, this is a local wood, this was made here. When you get into the early 19th century, things started to move around a little bit more. But a lot of what I've looked at is iconography in the furniture, classical influence through the carving, through the forms, that kind of is influenced by the ancient world. I gave a talk not long ago about early American furniture with direct influence from Pompeii. Things like klezmos chairs, well, you know, and banqueting sofas, paw feet, all these sorts of things that kind of started in the ancient world and ended up here in America. But I wanted to talk a little bit today, since we're in Petersburg. I wanted to specifically focus on, you know, Richmond and Petersburg. So that kind of sets the stage. So we had, you know, wealthy merchants commissioning grand houses, also commissioning furniture. Yes, some from overseas, but they were trying to, you know, support their local economy. They believed in their local economy. They were benefiting from their local economy. So, you know, rather than get something from England or France in the early 19th century, you know, they were happy to get something from a local guy versus having it shipped overseas. And you see a little bit of both, but there's kind of a transition there. And it's important to note that in this period, you know, we talked about the architecture, commissioning architecture in the classical style, commissioning furniture in the classical style, which is what we're going to get more into. But the interesting thing is that it permeated all aspects of life. A lot of these people were reading Greek and Latin. They were dressing in similar clothing, especially women, to the ancient Greeks and Romans. They were building their houses in the style of the ancient Greeks and Romans, or at least incorporating features and aspects. And then they were even designing their mausoleums and their funerary monuments after things like Greek urns and using Greek caryatids and Egyptian column motifs. So I say from birth until death, these people in the early 19th century were really trying to live out this classical ideal that they thought was, you know, the embodiment of the new nation, a nation built on freedom, you know, liberty, equality, all of these things. Now we know that not all of those things were necessarily true for all people. We know not all of those things were realized, but this is really what these people were trying to achieve, and they were trying to express through their material culture, through all of these different mediums. So with that being said, I'll talk specifically about some pieces of furniture. Some in my collection. I collect and curate exhibitions. I did an exhibit on classical furniture from Virginia and Maryland. I've done one on specifically Richmond furniture. It was at the John Marshall House. Hard to believe, back in 2019, before the pandemic. It was the first ever exhibit of Richmond furniture, period, which is really kind of hard to believe. No one had ever done too much there. But you know, never been a Petersburg exhibit. I'd love to do one day. And I think hopefully we'll be able to do more of these things as we, you know, continue to get people interested and continue to learn more. A lot of the scholarship is it's still, you know, it's very much a work in progress. And like I said, the field hasn't been around for a long time, and so you know, it's something that every day we learn more and more. And so I'm excited about, you know, new things that are to come. But in talking specifically about pieces of furniture and architecture, I'm going to spend the rest of my time really focused in on furniture and architecture in Petersburg and Richmond, and some of the classical themes, classical motifs that you see, that you've probably seen, you know, in your everyday wanderings that maybe you've noticed or maybe you haven't. But a lot of these things they were thought out, or they were at least copied. You know, there wasn't a guy with a chisel just going, oh, I'm gonna carve some leaves. You know, he was looking at something most of the time. It's great when you get something folky or whimsical, but a lot of the time they were looking at a pattern book, or they were looking at something else and copying it, which is really interesting, because you see different derivatives of different things showing up different places based on materials, based on the quality of the craftsman. So you might see, you know, a really great Chinese Chippendale staircase. I think one of the best in the country is here at Battersea. But go to England and, you know, there's plenty of similar kinds of things there. But this one is obviously significant because it's Petersburg, it's Virginia, and it's got a special story. But it's got its own kind of unique history. You know, I've talked to some people about who carved that. Where were they trained? Did they make furniture too? I know of some pieces of furniture that could have possibly been made by the same person, could have been carved by the same person, but hard to prove that without documentation. But any way you look at it, a lot of these things can be put into groups. So if you see a really great carved piece of Petersburg furniture from the 1760s, and it's got, you know, some Chinese Chippendale elements, some Gothic elements, you might want to think about the relationship with the staircase. What, you know, and it would probably be the staircase influencing the furniture, probably not the reverse. But so I'm going to be talking a little bit about classical furniture in Richmond, which is my expertise, but also how that kind of spills over into Petersburg. And when we talk about Petersburg, it's very complex. It used to be thought, you know, and things continue to change. So, you know, everything you hear, you have to kind of question and take with a grain of salt. But it used to be traditionally thought that Petersburg was just copying Williamsburg. That's all they were doing, copying Williamsburg. Similar things show up here that show up in Williamsburg. So they must have just been copying Williamsburg, right? Because it was a bigger city, more important, closer, you know, close by. Absolutely wrong. Were they looking at Williamsburg? Were they aware of things from Williamsburg? Were they maybe importing some things from Williamsburg? Absolutely. But they were also looking to London. They were looking to bigger cities like Norfolk, which, you know, in the 18th century, Norfolk was really the largest port in Virginia before it was more or less wiped off the face of the earth by the British. Places like Suffolk and Richmond a little bit later. And, you know, this is something that is really important to note. They were also looking to London, to France, to the same pattern books that the cabinet makers in Williamsburg were looking at. There's a guy, Alexander Taylor, who lived in Petersburg in the 18th century, who had a copy of, you know, Chippendale. So the easy answer is it was coming from not Williamsburg. Williamsburg was one part of the pie, but it was coming from all of these different places, and pattern books had a huge role in this. So that's just something really interesting, I think, to think about when you think about furniture in Petersburg. So some classical elements I'll talk about today are things like fluting and reeding, things like paw feet, things like keystones and arches. You know, all of these things have a classical precedent. Things like urns that you see over and over. I love urns. You see them almost everywhere if you know where to look. Sometimes they don't quite look like an urn, but if you look close enough, you realize that's kind of what they were looking at or what they were going for. So I brought some images today, since we're outside, and hopefully you'll be able to kind of see as I hold them up. I'm happy to pass some of them around, but I wanted to share with you, talk about some pieces of furniture from Richmond and Petersburg, and also architecture, kind of how it all works together. So for instance, I love to start with this. This is a piece from my collection, and it's a sideboard. really big piece of furniture. But you'll notice the most distinctive feature is these really distinctive urns with ball feet. And this is a direct, derivative of a classical urn going back to Greece and Rome. You also can see there's fluted pilasters here. So fluting goes back to the ancient Greeks and Romans. And so what otherwise would be just a simple box, add some urns, add some fluting, and you have what I think is a really, really nice piece of Richmond furniture. And you see this show up in other ways. I've never quite seen this urn. That's why I was really happy to find this. And this was in my Richmond exhibit, and I actually realized when I was moving it, I had never noticed before, on the back sign in chalk, it actually says you can see R-I-C-H. And that's all you can see. So really pretty confident this is Richmond. It has yellow pine secondary wood and some white pine, but everything you would expect to see in a Richmond sideboard. Most of the ones you see don't have these urn feet necessarily. Maybe they're a little bit more plain. But one of my favorite pieces, in spite of the fact that it's so big, you could practically live in the thing. Yeah, go.
Just a question about the urn. Does it have any symbolism or any meaning, like the pineapple, or
What?
other than?
Well, what do you think the pineapple means?
Friendship.
It's hospitality, yeah.
And when do you think that idea
I
came
have no
about?
idea.
Yeah.
1760s.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the pineapple, because a lot of the places you see what looks like a pineapple is actually not a pineapple. It's
Okay.
actually a thyrsus, which is Dionysus's staff. If you look at Dionysus's staff, on the top of it is a pine cone with acanthus leaves around it. It looks just like a pineapple. So in a lot of the early American stuff, people saw what was intended to look like a thyrsus, which is actually a symbol of, a lot of these symbols can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. To your question, the thyrsus, Dionysus being, a god of wine, but also fertility, it's interesting that I actually own a bed where all the 4 columns are the thyrsus.
Okay.
So it's a fertility symbol. It makes sense it would be in a bed where a woman might be, having childbirth. So the Southern hospitality thing came a little bit later, and everyone sees the pineapple on the early American piece, and they say, "Oh, Southern hospitality,"
But it's not.
but it's actually a Greek god's staff, which I just think is really, really amazing, and kind of elevates it a little bit in my mind, maybe from pineapple. But to your point, later people actually did use pineapples, and they were a symbol of hospitality. The urn can mean a lot of different things. Most of these things have symbolism relating to positive things like liberty. The urn in particular, I think, was kind of representative of in a way, and used in the funerary context of life and of everlasting life and some of those sorts of ideas. But all of these things, the meaning has kind of changed over time, and different meanings to different people. And you look in books, and sometimes you see something and it means 20 things, and you're like, well, this kind of means everything. But most of these things, including the urn, symbolize ideas of things like fertility, things like life, things like the everlastingness of life, things like life after death, those sorts of things. And sometimes urns were actually used to hold ashes. A lot of these urns that show up from antiquity, if you look at ancient Greek urns, some of them were actually used, some of them were actually just made as funerary monuments. So I hope that kind of answers your question. But other, I wanted to get an idea. I meant to do this in the beginning. How many of you all collect antiques or consider yourself collectors. I know about you. Sort of. How many of you are from Petersburg? You count. How many of you live in historic houses?
Depends on what you call historic.
Well, I knew I was going to get that question, and I'll leave that to you. Well, if you want my humble opinion, you know, pre-1840, but you know, we'll count anything that's 100 years old or older. I think that's fair. So you see these classical symbols coming up in furniture, and the urn is one that thank you, that you'll see over and over. This is a clock made in Richmond, and this has, one of the things I love is these paw feet. Now, paw feet is the theme of the lecture today, because you see these over and over. And where does the paw foot come from? Well, that's a complicated question, because you could say it's the Greeks and the Romans, but the Romans really copied the Greeks, and the Greeks, you know, were not necessarily the first person to use the paw foot. The first person to use the paw foot was probably the Egyptians, but you can even trace derivatives of it back to Mesopotamia. So the paw foot more or less goes back to the beginning of civilization. Now, the paw feet we see showing up in early American furniture are really derivatives of Greek paw feet mostly. So some of these paw feet I've actually been able to kind of trace back to ancient theaters in Greece and things like that that are carved of marble. You see those sorts of things. You see things that were originally marble now being expressed in wood and other mediums. But this one really has it going on, because you have, I mean, it says Richmond. It's got these great paw feet. It's got columns that have Ionic capitals, and it's got this great pediment. So there's just a lot going on with that. This is one of them. Sure. Yeah.
Would you mind just suggesting a date to give us an idea of the things that you have an opinion about?
Sure. Most of these things are first quarter 19th century. So the sideboard would be about 1815, 1820, and the clock is about 1820. So most of these things are first quarter 19th century, and same with this. You know, you'd say about 1815, 1820 approximate dates. You know, you can never assign an exact date unless there's a document. So it's always usually a range of 5 or 10 years, give or take. But this is about 1815. This is a cellaret, and this is a form you see a lot in New York City, but I believe this one could have possibly been made in Richmond. It's going to take a lot more research, but you see again the same kind of paw feet, but this shape, does this shape remind anybody of anything? Yeah, stone. It's meant to look like a sarcophagus. It's kind of it's called a sarcophagus form cellaret, and this is one that has a provenance at Brook Hill, which is a house in Richmond, an old Richmond family. You know, I found this there, and I said, well, could this be Richmond? It's funny, I did the Richmond furniture show, and I had a couple that came from Alexandria that I know that are big collectors, and they said, we came just to see this cellaret because we have one. And I said, oh, really? They said it's exactly the same. And I said, well, where do you think it's from? And they said we always kind of thought it might be Virginia. And I said, there we go. There's a connection here, because it's not quite of the quality you'd necessarily see in downtown New York. It's a little bit quirky, a little bit off, and that's what you might kind of expect to see, something in Richmond that's based off of a New York prototype. Sometimes they brought a New York one down and they copied it. John Marshall had, he bought a set of chairs from Boston, and he said, these aren't comfortable. I want 2 bigger, comfortable ones. So what did he do? He got a local Richmond cabinet maker to make him 2 bigger, comfortable ones. They weren't made of rosewood because, it wasn't really readily available in Richmond. They were made of poplar, but they were grain painted to look like rosewood. So really, really interesting stories about things being copied and things being influenced off. Thanks, Clark. Vanna White here. This table, one of my favorite pieces is a Richmond, probably Richmond tea table, and it's got a lot going on. It's got the urn again. It's got these turnings. It's got fluting on the legs, and then it's got these same brass ball feet. The brass ball feet, I mean, the fluting and the brass ball feet, you just see everywhere. I mean, that is a hallmark of this period of classicism. And you know, again, the brass is what would have been stone in antiquity. Sometimes in Richmond, where they didn't have brass, you'll see just carved wood feet. And it's funny, you know, back in the day, it was much more expensive to get the brass, so they had the feet carved of wood. It gets complicated because sometimes they got the wood shipped in from New York. They like got a bunch of pre-carved legs shipped in, and they just put them on a pedestal in Richmond. So you had a lot of that sort of stuff going on. But it's funny, like if you find a table that is made in Richmond that actually has its original carved Paul feet, that would have been cheaper at the time, but it's kind of more interesting now. Just like, you know, faux painted doors and faux painted marble, you know, marbling on baseboards, like we have at Battersea with the faux painted doors, you know, yellow pine meant to look like mahogany. Those doors are a lot more interesting grain painted than they would be if they were just mahogany doors. So it's funny how things, you know, things have kind of changed over time. But this is a really great piece. And, you know, all these attributions, a lot of the classical stuff that's Richmond, it's pretty safe to say it's Richmond, but you know, you could make an argument, or it's always possible that some of it could be Petersburg, because there was a lot of back and forth. Obviously, during this period, you know, Petersburg is more known for its, you know, mid-late 18th century furniture than its early 19th century furniture, because when Jefferson built the Capitol, when it moved to Richmond, it sucked a lot of the air out of the room, and you know, Petersburg still had a lot going on in the early 19th century, but then obviously Civil War, totally different story. Basically, the end of the Petersburg as we knew it was kind of there. You know, obviously Richmond changed a lot too, but you know, you kind of think of, a lot of people don't think of Petersburg as really the more important city in the 18th century. Richmond is the more important city in the early 19th century than going kind of beyond. Thanks. This is just an interesting one because it's a rare piece that was in my exhibit. It's a card table, and it's got this great panel, and it's, again, you see this this reeded edge again. You know, they love to put that there, and it was considered an extra feature. So you could probably buy this table without the reeded edge. It would be cheaper. If you wanted the reeded top edge, you'd have to pay a little bit more for it. And the feet, you know, what do they look like? They kind of look like reversed urns. Some people call them trumpet feet and things like that. But you know, going back to that same kind of urn form, this card table is really interesting because it's labeled, which is really, really rare. Actually, I think it's only one, and this is labeled by, there's a pair of them, also descended of Brookhill, pair of them labeled by James Rockwood, cabinet and chair maker. It even says where his shop was, opposite the Swan Tavern, Chocoville in Richmond. So this is great because this table has actually helped us attribute things to Richmond because it's extremely, extremely rare. I met someone once from a museum who said, I mean, someone asked me, you know, how do you know who made something or where it was made? And someone from another museum said, oh, because they signed and labeled it. And I said, no, that's probably less than 1%, maybe 0.01% of the time that you get something signed and labeled. Really, really rare, especially in Richmond. So this table has been able to kind of help attribute other pieces that are similar. Now, some people can go way overboard with that. They say, oh, label, this table looks like this table. It must have been made by this guy. Not the case, because there were probably a couple of these guys doing the same things he probably had another guy who just sat and turned the leg. Actually, I know he did. His name was John Haywood, who would just turn the legs all day, and would give them the different makers. And the cabinet maker, you almost have to think of a cabinet maker, this guy, James Rockwood, as like a general contractor. He would have farmed out, the brass canister, the brass, parts. He would have maybe farmed out some of the carving, some of the turning, but still a really interesting Richmond-made piece. And if you see pieces that are similar, you want to say, oh, could this be Richmond? But then you got to look for other things like secondary wood provenance and all that. It's not simply, oh, same style, that must be Richmond. But if you dig a little deeper, these things help you a lot. It's a cool label. So that's kind of that's some highlights of Richmond furniture, and there's not a lot of Richmond furniture identified in museum collections. A lot of it's in private collections. So that's it's not as accessible. So that's probably one of the reasons that there hasn't been as much work done on it. I'm continuing to try to do more work. So if anybody's interested in supporting that or being a part of that, and also, I'm a member of the Antiquarian Society in Richmond, and always interested in anybody who has a piece of Richmond furniture that has provenance or has a good story, those sorts of things. Because you can literally find one piece of furniture with a really good provenance that can lead you to attributing an entire group of furniture. The next kind of group I wanted to talk about is some things in Petersburg that exhibit some similar characteristics. One of my favorite chairs. Chairs are really great because they embody a lot of different motifs. You usually have carving in this period and that sort of thing. This is really one of my favorite chairs. It's likely made in Petersburg, right here. If you study furniture, you might know it, but it has a lot going on. It's circa 1800, 1810, a little bit earlier than the other things we talked about, kind of from what you would call the Federal period, although Federal classical kind of overlaps. But this chair, you'll notice that it has carving, and so this part I'll save for last. But at the top, you see this is really a fluted lozenge at the top in the middle, and then you see lotus leaves at the top, all coming from antiquity. These same lotus leaves at the top in the carving, you see it on Baltimore furniture, you see it on architecture, and I want to talk more about architecture in a second, but the governor's mansion in Richmond, the Wickham House, if you look at the columns in the governor's mansion, what do you see at the top of the column of the Capitol? You see these same lotus leaves. You see them on furniture, you see them on column capitals. So when you're driving around Richmond, and then even on Monument Avenue, when classicism was revived yet again, the early 20th century, you'll see the lotus leaf. And I actually can tell you that the column on the governor's mansion and on the Wickham House is really pretty much a copy of a known ancient temple, which is, the Tower of the Winds, which was on the Athenian Acropolis. So you can literally just trace it right back. And the same thing has kind of happened in furniture, where they're expressing some of these motifs here. The last part that I really love is this what some people would say is a flower. Some people call them pinwheels. But really what they're based off of, as far as we know and as far as the research suggests, they are a pattern. In the singular, it's a patera. But these pinwheels, patera, actually were kind of inspired by ancient Greek kylix. So when you drink wine from a kylix, you had two handles, you would drink up like this. And then, once you finish the wine, once you sailed the wine dark sea, you'd see some kind of a pattern, circular oval pattern. Sometimes they were more, intricate or complex than other times. But these kind of pinwheel things, they're not pinwheels. They didn't have pinwheels then. They are, classical precedent. So a lot of these things, just like the pineapple, people kind of attach, what they look like today. But when the person was making this in the early 19th century, they were probably kind of thinking about both. And in the case of the Wickham House staircase and some other pieces of furniture, sometimes you see dogwood flowers and things. And sometimes it looks more like a patera, and sometimes it looks more like a flower. Sometimes it looks in between. But there's no denying that that's one of the inspirations for this. So this is a great example of where it shows up on a Petersburg chair. And now I'm going to show you where it shows up on Petersburg architecture, which I think is really interesting. Has anyone seen these around Petersburg or Richmond? Well, you will if you look for them. And so now here's some buildings that you might know and you might not know. This one, the McElwain House, which is where I gave a previous lecture, and I had the privilege of spending a lot of time in the parlor. Look right here, Patera, and this is a really great example because its proportions are great. It kind of looks like a fan, but it really is in that true kind of form of the Patera. And obviously, this mantle, really one of the best in Petersburg, really one of the best in the country. Not only does it have the central Patera in the middle of the mantelpiece, it has columns that flank it with two little patera underneath on both sides. And we have scrolls. We have that same fluting we've been talking about. We've got columns. We've got it all going on here, which I really love. And you see this motif in Petersburg. I'd love to do more research specifically and try to figure out kind of who was carving these things, because it's a Petersburg thing. It's kind of a vernacular feature that you don't really see show up anywhere else the same way it shows up in Petersburg. Other Virginia, cities of importance during this period, you see some similar things, but this is a really interesting kind of Petersburg characteristic. So that's the McElwain House parlor. Another example is in the Farmer's Bank. I love the Farmer's Bank. The interiors are really fabulous. And right here, smack dab in the middle of the mantle, what do we have? A Patera. And on the columns, we have two Patera too. So, I'm happy with just one in the middle, but when you have one on the middle and two on each side, I'm really happy with that. And then you have the same kind of, brackets, and you have the fluting, really great examples. Some of the best that survive, but if you look at these, kind of compare them to the furniture, and you can kind of see how it was connected. The whole idea of looking into a kylix, and that would have been a really interesting kind of discussion piece for these people. In this time period, architecture, furniture, it was kind of an architectural amphitheater with the furniture, where consider the architecture as the theater and the furniture as the actors on display. So it was all kind of giving you a performance that you could kind of talk about, as you were having conversation. If you didn't have anything else to talk about, well, you certainly could talk about the room. And you could certainly talk about the furniture, and you could certainly talk about things like, ancient Greek iconography, pateras, fluting, and things like that. Or just about how amazing and expensive it was to do this kind of work. If all else failed, right? I really love this because this is a little bit more rare. Anybody know? This photo was taken at night, and all these photos were taken by me. Well, pretty much, other than some of the furniture ones that are in the museum. But somebody said it.
Strawberry Hill.
Yeah, exactly. also had the you know, the honor of spending a lot of time, for lack of a better word, at Strawberry Hill, and you know, this door surround is just to die for. Same kind of patera you'll see, and I think a lot of people have probably driven past, or if you've been there, I don't know if you would have ever noticed, but you know, because the door is pretty impressive itself. It's got a nice pediment. It's got that same, you know, fluted pilasters, but it's got the patera on both sides too. So it's really great to see it in interior architecture, exterior architecture, and then on furniture. It kind of all kind of goes together and matches up. And I think the more we study this and look at it, the more examples we would find. I'd love to find more examples on furniture. Sometimes you see it on inlay and Hepplewhite furniture, earlier furniture. 1790, 1810 is the time frame for Hepplewhite furniture. But you'll see the patera, you know, really well defined in inlay. I'll show you a piece of inlay furniture next. This is I don't know, you know, you can't say enough about this chair. Petersburg chair, which is just killer, and it's in the Williamsburg collection, and you know, looks like something that, you know, first glance someone would say was made, you know, somewhere else, but made in Petersburg. The woods are yellow pine gum, and it has a inlay, which I was just talking about, and this was attributed to Alexander Taylor, but you see a lot of interesting motifs going on. I mentioned the pateras earlier. This does not have the patera inlay. Most of the time you see that on like a card table or a sideboard, just because it's so big. It's hard to incorporate that into the splat of the chair. But this has, and you know, this has, a little hard to see in the picture, but this has bellflowers, which you know go way back, and they've been used since ancient times. They were used in the Renaissance. But you see the bellflower inlay here. And then what you have is a galoche. It's called a galoche pattern, which is kind of a, you know, there's a lot of different derivatives of a galoche, but basically it's kind of an interweaving kind of a motif. You see that in kind of a string inlay that goes all the way up here. And then you have these beautiful archways, which all, you know, the arch is something we'll talk about a little bit more. But the arch goes back to the Assyrians, the Egyptians, of course the Romans, but the Romans were by no means the first people to use an arch or a keystone, which we'll talk about. But this is really one of my favorite pieces of Petersburg furniture that, you know, I've never seen anything else like it from Petersburg. I'm sure there's other things that exist, but it's really, really wonderful. Pass that around. And talking about arches and keystones, which you see, you know, in furniture and architecture. Doors are a great place to look. I mean, Petersburg, Fredericksburg, Old Town Alexandria. I love to look at the door surrounds, the entryways, because you see a lot of classicism on the exterior. That might be the only place on the exterior of the house that you see classicism, would be the door surround. Sometimes there's a keystone above the doors. This is one of my favorite examples from Petersburg. Does anybody recognize this door? I'm sure you do.
Is that the Farmer's Bank?
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
Next time you walk by, take a closer look, because it has a lot going on. It is really wonderful. One of the best, in my opinion. It's got this, you know, these great fluted pilasters, what you call a fan light, really nice fan light. This pediment, triangular pediment, dental molding, archway, and what do you see in the middle? What we call a keystone. Now the keystone is something really interesting that a lot of people, I don't think they think much about it. But the keystone does not go as far back as the arch. Arches go back to the Egyptians and the Assyrians. The keystone was actually really first used by the Romans. You know, the Romans, you know, really simplifying it, the Romans, you know, in my opinion, you know, they basically took ancient Greek architecture and art to the world. They basically sacked Corinth and copied everything. There really were no, you know, classical buildings and, you know, classical, you know, the things you think of, the sculptures and the buildings with columns that are Roman. You didn't see those before. You didn't see those before Rome sacked Corinth. Corinth, the taking of Corinth, was really that pinnacle moment where Rome took Greek art and architecture to the world, and then you enter the Hellenistic period, 1st century AD. And so this is really one of my favorite examples, and you know, hard pressed to find another one exactly like this in Petersburg. But you know, again, the fluting, the archway, going back to the Egyptians and the Assyrians, and the keystone, which Romans. So why did they use the keystone? Any ideas what it was for? Well, when you think about the Romans, you know, the one thing I think the Romans really added to Greek art and architecture has got the one thing the Romans really added to Greek art and architecture after they stole it and copied it, pretty much, and sacked it, was really great engineering accomplishments. When I think of the Romans, maybe I'm biased. Jefferson loved the Romans. The Virginia State Capitol is not a Greek temple, it is a Roman temple. Everything you see that is Jeffersonian architecture came from Roman precedents and Roman inspiration. But Rome took from Greece and kind of updated it a little bit. So the Romans, you see domes like at the Pantheon. The Romans were the first to use the keystone because it helped to separate the load on the arch and kind of spread it out over both sides. So the keystone, what a great decorative feature, but also the Romans served a structural feature of spreading out the weight bearingness of the archway. So it's just really cool to think about that. On this door, is this carved keystone helping to keep the door up? No, not at all. But it's a decorative element that they saw in ancient Rome that they then decided to, oh, we have an arch, let's put a great keystone. And again, getting back to that theme of, you know, in Rome, they would have never, in Rome this would have looked silly. They would have said, why do you have a keystone to support walls? It's all one piece of wood. You know, what's the point? But in early America, you see this adapted into really wonderful carving, whereas in Rome it would have been stone, obviously. And so I love these door surrounds. I probably have 10,000 pictures of door surrounds from Virginia, and you know, there's some houses on High Street that have some really nice ones, but I love to think about the keystone, which a lot of people just say, oh, it's just a decorative element. Well, there's a whole story there that I think is real interesting. And one of the final images I want to show you is, it's really all in one, as far as an interior in Petersburg. Anybody know where this is?
Center here.
Strawberry? Sergey?
Folly Castle.
A lot of you probably can't see it, so be careful. Scott?
Folly.
I'll give you a clue. The picture I just showed you before is the outside. So it's the interior of the Farmer's Bank. Now, it hasn't been open to the public in a long time, so I'm not surprised.
There.
Yeah, but it is really
That's different
just,
with furniture in it too.
yeah. I'm sure you've been up there at some point, but just, you know, when I went up there, I just about fell down the stairs because it is just so elaborate and so precise with the interior finishings and the features, specifically the carving. And when I when I look at a house, you know, I'm kind of beelining for the carving, because that's the connection with furniture. That's where you see a lot of the classicism expressed. So if I go into a house, I'm going straight for the mantle, or I'm going straight for the doors. You know, not really looking at the plaster work quite as much. But it's all interesting. But this is a fabulous interior. I'll pass this around too, where you see, again, we have patera going across the top. We have one in the middle, centripetera. Then we have two on the flanking columns. Then you have actually, you know, double flanking columns. You have King of Prussia marble inserted as the firebox, which is really, really wonderful to see. You know, American materials, really the best marble in my opinion. So just a wonderful fireplace, but again, very much based on classical motifs. We have the multiple versions of the patera, the kylix. We have columns. We have fluting in between on this kind of entablature of the mantle. So every aspect of this was classically derived. Then we have this great interior doorway that, you know, has a fan light. I love to see an interior fan light. Actually, the interior fan light is a little more elaborate than the exterior fan light, which is really interesting because, you know, it's kind of a Petersburg thing. They did it other places, but you see it a lot here. See it other places too, but you definitely see it in Petersburg, where some of the upstairs rooms, you know, some places, the downstairs rooms, that's where they put all their money, that's where they put all their effort. In Virginia, and specifically in Petersburg, you really want to get upstairs, because that's where some of the really good stuff is. And so here we have the same kind of thing. We have these fluted columns, we have panel doors, but then we have this arch with a keystone in the middle. And as I'm looking at these two keystones, they look pretty similar. Probably carved almost certainly by the same person. So it's interesting to think of materials over time, how things were once used for functionality, now used as pure ornamentation. And so I hope that you know, this is kind of giving you a little bit of insight. You know, as Scott knows, I could talk about this all day. Literally, Scott's been one of my partners in Richmond furniture explorations, so I'm glad. But he's also got a booth, so I'll forgive him for missing the furniture part. But I think he's seen it all already. But anyway, so I hope I've kind of given you an idea of kind of setting the stage with what was going on in this time period in the United States, what was going on in Virginia as a whole, what was going on in Richmond and Petersburg, and how that can be traced directly back to antiquity. And so I always like to stop on one of my favorite quotes from a Richmonder who could also, you know, everyone makes a claim to this man. Petersburg could make a claim to him too. Edgar Allan Poe, since he spent his honeymoon here downtown, which I think is really interesting. And he spent a decent amount of time in Petersburg, you know, going to the playhouses and the bars and whatnot, which I think is just a really wonderful picture to imagine Edgar Allan Poe wandering the streets of Petersburg, but he certainly did. To quote Edgar Allan Poe, the furniture that I've talked about today, the architecture that I've talked about today, quote, it harkens to the glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome. So thank you so much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you.
What did I miss? Well, you can come see the pictures. Anybody have any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I guess there were two things that I was a little surprised by, and I guess I wanted to just ask them to, and one thing that I thought you just might find interesting about Petersburg if you haven't seen it, but I think, the first thing was, I thought the Klezmos chairs were Greek, not Pompeian.
They are, Klezmos chairs are Greek. There is there's a Roman adaptation.
I see.
So yes, almost certainly they started with the Greeks, and you see them on sometimes there's a great, I like to use Virginia examples where I can. At the VMFA, there's a great example of a Kylix that has a Klezmos chair pictured on the back, and the man's being served wine from a servant, and he's drinking out of a Kylix, which is really great. So yes, you're absolutely right. The origin of that Klezmos design with those sweeping legs and that back is definitely Greek. The Romans adapted it, and there's literally, and I spent a lot of time looking into this because I had the same question at one point. I'm like, well, you see him in Rome, you see him in Greece, like what's going on here? There's a Roman adaptation of it, and it's interesting. The Roman adaptations don't always have the sweeping legs. The legs are straight in a lot of cases. But in early America, even you see copies of the Greek Klezmos and you see copies of the Roman Klezmos. So if you go to, gosh, I'm trying to think of the closest place that has one, Baltimore Museum of Art. A lot were made in Baltimore.
Yeah.
I mean, Baltimore, Philadelphia was where a lot of these were made. Benjamin Latrobe supposedly, possibly designed some of them. John and Hugh Finley, who were cabinet makers, are making them in Baltimore. The closest place I can think of where there is a really good one is there's a John and Hugh Finley one in the Kaufman collection at the National Gallery. There's also one attributed to Latrobe suite. They think the first, it's pretty well documented. There's drawings and things. The first furniture for the White House included Greek Klezmos chairs, possibly designed by Benjamin Latrobe. John and Hugh Finley, really great painters. They were also producing these, but also in Baltimore. Baltimore, when you look at classism in this period, you really got to think about Baltimore because they really, really most important city in the country, Deepwater Harbor, really fabulous place. They document a lot of the furniture really well. There's a lot that survives. You also see the Roman Klezmos show up. So there's a cabinet maker with the last name Reinhardt who does painted Klezmos chairs. They have that same kind of curved back, kind of a similar splat, but then they just have straight legs with cuffs at the top, which is more of a Roman thing. So you can get really, and a lot of people get a little bit confused, just like in early American furniture, they might call a couch a Grecian sofa. But some of those Grecian sofas are not really Grecian as much as they're copies of like a Roman, what would be a triclinium. So there's a lot of overlap and a lot of different adaptation, but there is usually a little bit of a distinction between a Greek one and a Roman one. There's usually a little bit of a difference. They're not always just copying, straight up. Just like the Greek architecture and the Roman architecture, you see some difference with the orders of the columns and with the designs of the temples and things like that from Greece versus Rome. In Greece, you might be looking at, temples like the Parthenon. Rome, you're looking at things like the Pantheon. So you can see where it came from, but they've kind of taken it to another level, if that makes sense. But that's an excellent question.
I had another one, but I want to give other people an opportunity to ask.
No, go ahead.
The other thing, I had always thought that the Temple of the Winds columns were acanthus leaves as opposed to lotus leaves.
So the Tower of the Winds, which was really best documented by Stewart and Revett. They went and they did wonderful drawings of everything. It has both. So the lotus leaves, some people call them, and there's a lot of different terms for a lot of different things. Some people say water leaves, some people say lotus leaves, some people say acanthus leaf. On the top of the column, I'm trying to think of a picture anymore. On the top of the column, the big leaves, the lotus leaves, they kind of splay out like this to support the column. They're big. Some people call them palm leaves. Lotus is kind of the signature for the adaptation in America, but you do see acanthus leaves sometimes behind the lotus leaves or with the lotus leaves. So, but you're absolutely right. And just like that chair, you know, acanthus leaves kind of have a more viney kind of look to them a lot of the time. And the palm or the lotus leaf is kind of a longer, you know, longer leaf. But you see combinations of both, and you know, some leaves it's like, oh goodness, what is this? Just you know, kind of an in-between thing. But that's a great question too, you know, because on a Corinthian column, obviously you see you know, acanthus leaves, and you see acanthus leaves on everything. And a lot of people say, oh, it's a leaf, it's on a piece of furniture, it must be an acanthus leaf. But if they're long and straight and curved, they're, you know, I would call them a lotus leaf.
Yeah.
But there might be somebody, I don't, you know, it's funny in furniture, you know, sometimes I end up down rabbit holes of looking at actual leaves to see, you know, on the drive over here, I was looking at different types of bellflowers. You see bellflowers in Europe and you see them in America, and it's like, well, where did this come from? Who started it? And you know, it's not an exact science, so it's always more research to be done. But
My friend just showed me a picture, and I see
It is
exactly what
lotus
you're
from
talking
top to
about.
bottom.
yeah, so does that make
That
sense?
was very helpful to actually see it again.
So was I right?
Yeah,
Well,
but
yeah.
he was half right.
Well, we were both right.
We were both right.
Yeah, which is always nice.
Yeah.
I guess my other comment was, and this is just a comment, not a question, just FYI for people who are from Petersburg, but there is a house on High Street that has what I would call lotus leaf capitals on the columns. And I don't know if you know the house I'm talking about or
I
not.
think you might. Are you maybe talking about the only Egyptian revival
Yes,
house? I think
yes,
in Virginia.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
Which is a fabulous house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's got lots of colors.
Oh
and
yeah,
stuff.
it's great. It's a little bit later.
Yes, it is later than your period.
Yeah, but I love that house, and I have pictures of that. And you know, if I was given a lecture, you know, on this with a PowerPoint, I probably would show that.
Yeah. What year do you think it is? 1850 or?
It's usually so the Egyptian revivals kind of coincided with the Greek revivals. So 1840s.
Okay.
There, so yeah, it can go into 1850s. So you're exactly right. But it is interesting because you'll see a Greek revival house that maybe has some Egyptian motifs. But if you go into that Egyptian revival house, which is just so rare, and if you like Egyptian revival stuff, around the same time, a little bit earlier, almost late 1830s, 1840, is the original Medical College of Virginia building on the MCV campus, which is really probably the best Egyptian revival building in the country, and the one on High Street is probably one of the best. I mean, I can't really think of any that compare, and I love those column capitals you're talking about with the lotus leaves. But if you go inside, you'll notice some things. Well, you'll notice some Egyptian things, like I think there's wings of Horus and things like that. But then you'll notice some things that they just went with the Greek revival stuff. So most Egyptian revivals have Greek revival tucked in there, because Greek revival was, you know, just much more common. You know, I mean, we have so many Greek revival houses in Richmond and Petersburg, and Egyptian revival, that house and, you know, the public building by MCV are the only two that I can really think of from that period. Now again, you know, then there was another revival in the early 20th century where you see some of these things pop up again. You see all of these things pop up again. Not quite the same, but interesting too. But yeah, I love that house, and you know, it makes me want to drive by there today.
Interestingly enough, just to confuse the issue that much more, when I was here years ago, we actually found an exact copy of that building in a pattern book.
Oh, really?
But what makes it interesting is in the pattern book, the identification was Indian.
Oh, okay.
Indian.
That makes sense.
Not Egyptian,
Well,
but
there's
Indian.
a lot wrong
And it's
with
an
Because it's
exact-
the lotus. I mean, it's the lotus leaf is also in
Well,
India.
and the illustration was exactly like that house.
Yeah,
What pattern book was it in?
I don't remember. I probably have that
Oh,
somewhere
you're
written
from-
down, but it was a real surprised.
Yeah, and
because,
Yeah, I'd really
you know,
like to know that book.
Yeah, I'd love to
Yeah.
dig it.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Oh
it
yeah,
was
at least,
18
probably 1850
70s, I
or
wanna
earlier.
say.
Yeah, you should dig that up.
Yeah.
But you hit a good point, and this goes back to the you know, different terminology. That's why this can be difficult, because you know, people might call one thing Indian, they might call it something like Ottoman or Turkish, and it might ultimately be it. I mean, so often it goes back to Egyptian, Roman, Greek.
It's foreign, you know.
Yeah, there's
it's all
Yeah,
the same.
it's Oriental. It's Oriental.
just-
Use a catch.
Just
phrase.
like Marie Antoinette had a fabulous classical porcelain service, and it's called the Etruscan service. It's not Etruscan. But Etruscan sounded great, so anything that looked classical in that period was Etruscan. Which you can take some of these paw feet and you can find Etruscan examples, which I think I'm really interested in Etruscans. There's like one book that a German guy wrote on Etruscan furniture, and I tried to track literally in the world one guy who knew about it, one guy who wrote the book. He's German. I've emailed with him, and he's like, "Oh, come to Germany. I'll meet with you." If only that was so easy right now. But I really want to dig deeper into, you know, Calder Loth does an amazing job of this with architecture, of saying this was the classical precedent. This is the early American. The Tower of the Wind. I mean, the textbook example I think is really great is the Tower of the Winds, because you see that copied on the governor's mansion, and you see it on the Wickham House, and you see it other places. But then another good one, that's a good one in Virginia. On Monumental Church, the columns, they're fluted on the bottom and the top. And if you see Monumental Church, they're fluted on the bottom and the top, which people are like, oh, they must have been trying to save money, not fluting all the way up and down. Well, no, those columns appear on a temple on the Greek island of Delos. So there's a precedent. So a lot of times people think, oh, they just got quirky with it. No, they were actually copying something. So there's a lot of those kind of examples, and it's always nice when you can match it up perfectly, but you know, people take some liberties. Another one is the Ionic of the Erechtheion from the Athenian Acropolis. The Ionic of the Erechtheion is really distinctive, and in my opinion, really one of the best examples of an Ionic column. I think a lot of people would agree. The best preserved one is in the British Museum, ironically, because the ones that were left out have corroded a little bit. But the Ironic of the Erechtheion, drive down Monument Avenue, and you'll see the exact same column on some of the really, really great classical revival houses on Monument Avenue from, you know, the early 20th century. But it's amazing to see how these things pop up over time, and then sometimes they'll even start out like there's some Tower of the Wind stuff going on Monument Avenue, and I believe that, you know, it started with a Stewart and Revette, 18th century, then it was a governor's mansion in Alexander Paris, and then it popped off again in the early 20th century in the local area. You see a little bit of it because they were like, oh, I want the same columns as the governor's mansion. I want the same columns as the Wickham House. You know, these are houses that have been pictured, published, visited, and so people copy. So you see these little, you see like, it's interesting to trace something from antiquity to where it shows up first in America, to then where it shows up in that region, and then to see how far it goes. And sometimes these things go all over the place, so it's hard to get a finger on where it started. But it, you know, you can really go down a lot of wormholes figuring that stuff out. But thank you for your really good questions.
Really enjoyed the talk.
Yeah,
Great.
thanks. Thanks. Yeah, sure.